The man stepped through the glass door like he was afraid it might shatter under his touch. It was early October 2009, and the police station in Riverton, Iowa, was the kind of place where even the chairs in the waiting area seemed to know everyone by name. The desk sergeant, a gray-haired officer who'd been working this post since the 80s, barely looked up when the bell over the door rang. But something about the man's posture caught his attention. He was thin, underfed thin, his faded flannel shirt hanging loose over narrow shoulders. His hair was uneven, as if cut with a kitchen pair of scissors. A few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, but the deep-set eyes made him seem younger than he probably was. "Can I help you?" the sergeant asked. The man's voice was flat, almost inaudible. "Can I get my dog back?" The sergeant blinked. "Excuse me?" "My dog," the man repeated, his gaze fixed somewhere over the sergeant's shoulder. "Buster, you took him." Then he said a name, a boy's name, that the sergeant hadn't heard spoken in nearly 2 decades, a name that was still tacked to the department's corkboard in a sun-faded missing child poster. The sergeant's fingers froze on the keyboard. That name didn't belong to a man. It belonged to a 10-year-old kid who vanished in 1992. 17 years earlier, Riverton had been the kind of place where people still left their front doors unlocked, where every other Saturday meant a pancake breakfast at the VFW Hall. Tommy Carver was part of that fabric, the second of 3 kids, a wiry boy with a sun-bleached mop of hair and a gap-toothed grin. He lived in a white clapboard house on a quiet street, the kind where bikes lay scattered on lawns until nightfall. The Carver's place had a wooden porch that creaked when you stepped on the 3rd board from the left. His mother, Diane, kept hanging baskets overflowing with petunias by the railing. His father, Mark, worked long hours at the John Deere plant, but was home most evenings, tinkering in the garage with the door rolled halfway up. And then there was Buster, a tan and white mutt with one floppy ear and a habit of following Tommy everywhere. To Tommy, Buster wasn't just a pet. He was the constant, the one who waited by the bus stop every afternoon, the one who lay across his feet during summer thunderstorms. That August evening in '92 was thick with heat, the kind that made the air shimmer above the asphalt. Diane had been in the kitchen, phone wedged between her shoulder and ear, balancing a conversation with her sister while stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce. Mark was out in the garage, bent over the hood of his pickup, radio low. Tommy was in the yard, tossing a scuffed tennis ball for Buster. The dog bounded after it, nails skidding on the patchy grass. The chain-link gate stood open. Not unusual. And the hum of cicadas filled the gaps between the hollow thump of the ball hitting the ground. 15 minutes. That's all it took. One moment he was there, sweat-damp hair clinging to his forehead. The next, silence. When Diane stepped out to call him in for dinner, Buster was tied to the porch railing, panting, tail thumping weakly. The tennis ball lay in the dirt a few feet away. The gate hung open. No Tommy. The panic started quietly, Diane checking the backyard, then the side alley, calling his name with a practiced mother's tone, expecting an answer. But her voice sharpened when there was none. She walked faster, then jogged, scanning driveways and hedges. By the time she hit the end of the block, she was running. Neighbors came out when they heard her. A woman in slippers joined her search, muttering that maybe he'd wandered toward the park. A man with a beer in his hand shaded his eyes, saying he hadn't seen him since the afternoon. Mark appeared from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag, confusion on his face. When Diane's voice cracked, "I can't find him," he dropped the rag and started toward the street without a word. Within an hour, the first squad car pulled up, red and blue lights spilling over the neat lawns. Officers fanned out, knocking on doors, asking the same questions over and over. Was he upset about anything? Had anyone new been in the neighborhood? By dusk, a search perimeter was in place. Volunteers combed the streets with flashlights, their beams slicing through the dark. Some called his name in steady intervals, others moved in tense silence. The Carvers stayed out there all night. Diane's voice grew hoarse. Mark sat in his pickup on the shoulder of County Road 6, staring at the tree line, headlights cutting into the dust. Just before midnight, a K-9 unit picked up Tommy's scent and followed it down the road toward the old tree break marking the start of a disused farm property. The trail ended there, abruptly, as if the boy had simply stepped off the earth. No footprints in the dry dirt, no sign of a struggle. Just an emptiness that felt wrong. By sunrise, the story had spread beyond Riverton. Camera crews showed up, their cables snaking across the front lawn. A reporter stood by the gate, rehearsing lines about the boy who vanished in plain sight. Back in the Riverton station, 2009, the man in the flannel shifted his weight, his eyes flicking briefly toward the missing person's corkboard. He seemed to register the faded photo of a boy with a gap-toothed smile, and then looked away. The sergeant's voice was careful now. "What's your name again?" the man told him. Same name as on the poster. Same name Diane Carver had whispered into the darkness every night for 17 years. And standing there, in the fluorescent light of the station, it was impossible to tell if he was a miracle, a hoax, or something far stranger. Just wondering? Where are you watching from? Write it down, Bello. In the first 48 hours after Tommy's disappearance, Riverton's streets changed. The familiar rhythm of the town, the distant hum of tractors, the clink of coffee cups at the diner, was replaced with the low roar of ATVs and the shuffle of boots in dry grass. By mid-morning the next day, the search had grown into something almost military. Uniformed officers moved shoulder to shoulder through the fields, the green of their vests jarring against the late summer gold of the weeds. Volunteers formed loose chains, calling out Tommy's name, their voices swallowed by the open space. At the high school gym, folding tables sagged under stacks of donated sandwiches, bottled water, and insect repellent. A wall-sized map of the county was peppered with colored pins and circles drawn in marker, tracking where teams had already searched. It was the dogs that made people quiet. German shepherds and bloodhounds, led by handlers in ball caps, swept the ditches and tree lines. You could tell when a scent caught, the sudden pull on the leash, the handler's quick hand signal, and everyone nearby would stop moving, listening. That first afternoon, one of the dogs led a group out toward the far edge of town, past the grain silos, to a thin strip of woods that bordered an abandoned soybean field. The ground was cracked and dry, weeds pushing through the rusted fence line. The dog circled twice, nose low, then sat back on its haunches. The handler shook his head. "It's gone cold here." In the heat, people moved slower. Sweat darkened the backs of their shirts, and dust clung to their shoes. Someone from the sheriff's office started passing out orange safety vests. They looked too bright, too clean against the muted colors of the Midwest in late August. Mark refused to go home. That night, he parked his truck at the corner of Miller Road and just sat there with the engine idling, staring down the black ribbon of asphalt toward the fields. Every set of headlights in the distance made his chest tighten, but none of them slowed. The second day brought the FBI. A white Suburban rolled into town, windows tinted, two men in dark suits stepping out with briefcases that looked wrong against the dusty backdrop. They spoke to the local police chief in low tones before moving inside. When they came out an hour later, they headed straight for the Carver's house. Diane met them on the porch, still wearing yesterday's clothes, hair pulled back in a loose braid. She listened, arms folded, as they explained the plan. Widened search perimeter, interviews with anyone who'd been in the area, background checks on neighbors and known offenders within a 50-mile radius. It all sounded efficient, clinical. But the only thing Diane could focus on was that they'd left Buster tied up in the yard again, tail wagging like nothing had changed. By the third day, the leads started to fray. A man 2 streets over swore he'd seen a white panel van creeping along their block an hour before Tommy vanished. He remembered the way it slowed near the Carver's yard, but not the license plate, not even the state. A teenage girl claimed she'd heard a child's voice crying out near the old Pierce farm that same evening. The Pierce place had been empty for years, windows boarded, fields gone wild. Deputies searched it from cellar to attic. They found nothing but broken furniture and a dead raccoon in the kitchen sink. The mood shifted after that. People were still showing up to help, but the urgency bled into exhaustion. Voices got quieter. The air was thick with something unspoken. Maybe they wouldn't find him here. At the sheriff's briefing on day 5, a local reporter asked if they were considering the possibility that Tommy had run away. It was the first time Diane had heard anyone suggest it out loud. She laughed, sharp, humorless, and told them her son wouldn't leave Buster behind, wouldn't just walk out without a word. The sheriff avoided her eyes when he spoke next. We're exploring all scenarios. That night, the local news aired a segment with old footage of Tommy riding his bike down their street, a baseball cap turned backward on his head. The anchor's voice was calm, almost soothing. As she said, investigators couldn't rule out that Tommy might have left voluntarily. Diane stood in the living room, clutching Buster's worn leather collar, the metal tag clicking softly against her wedding ring. She stared at the screen until the image blurred. A week in, the search scaled back. The roadblocks were gone. Helicopters stopped circling. Out-of-town volunteers returned home. The map in the gym came down, leaving faint outlines of marker circles on the paper. Mark still drove the back roads every evening, window down, scanning the ditches. Diane barely left the house except to sit on the porch at dusk, the hour Tommy used to come home from playing, half expecting to see him round the corner. On the 8th night, a TV crew asked Diane for an interview. They set up just inside the front gate, lights casting harsh shadows across the yard. She held the collar in both hands, knuckles white, voice trembling as she spoke into the camera. "If you can hear me, honey, please, just come home. We love you. We'll fix whatever's wrong. Just come home." The cameraman pulled focus on the empty swing set in the background, its seats swaying slightly in the night breeze. Somewhere beyond the reach of the porch light, a dog barked. Not Buster, but close enough to make Diane's head snap toward the dark. 17 years later, Riverton's police station hadn't changed much. Same scuffed linoleum, same humming vending machine in the corner. The smell of burnt coffee seemed permanent, absorbed into the walls. The man in the doorway looked like someone who'd walked a long way and hadn't decided if he'd stay. His boots were caked with a thin crust of dirt, the kind that clings after days without rain. A pale scar cut across the back of his right hand, disappearing into his sleeve. He kept his eyes low as he stepped forward. "Can I get my dog back?" The desk officer, a woman in her 40s who'd joined the force just after the Carver case went cold, didn't catch it at first. "Your dog?" "Buster," the man said. He lifted his head then, and there was a flicker. Not quite recognition, but something close in her expression. "What's your name?" she asked. When he told her, the room seemed to tilt. In the corner, the old corkboard of missing persons still hung, pushed off to one side. It was cluttered with weathered flyers, runaway teens, a couple of domestic disputes gone bad, one elderly man who'd wandered from a care home. And, in the top row, faded by the sun, the 10-year-old boy's face with the gap-toothed grin. The man didn't look at it long, just enough to register the image before turning back to the counter. "I need Buster," he said again, softer this time. The officer's mind was running ahead of her mouth. Buster was long gone, she thought. Dogs don't live 17 years. But she didn't say it. Instead, she pressed the intercom button for the on-duty sergeant. Sergeant Harris came out from the back, his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. One glance at the man was enough for him to stop mid-step. "You're saying you're Thomas Carver?" Harris asked, voice steady but slower now. The man nodded once. "Do you have any ID?" "No." "Where have you been?" The man's eyes shifted toward the floor, his jaw tightening. "Can't say." Harris motioned him toward the small interview room just off the main floor. The man hesitated before stepping inside, as if the walls might close in. He sat, hands flat on the table, fingers twitching in short, controlled movements. Up close, Harris could see the man's face more clearly. He was in his late 20s now, but his skin was weathered beyond his years, faint lines etched around his eyes. There were no obvious injuries, no sign of recent violence. Physically, he looked intact. Mentally, Harris couldn't place it. There was a guardedness that felt practiced. Back in the main office, the officer at the desk picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. She didn't expect Diane Carver to answer. Not at this hour. But she did. "Mrs. Carver, this is Officer Langford. We need you to come down to the station." There was a pause on the other end, the kind that hums with the sound of someone's breathing. "Why?" Diane asked, her voice cautious. Langford looked through the glass at the man sitting in the interview room. "We think we've found your son." At the Carver house, Diane stood in the hallway gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. The kitchen clock ticked behind her, loud in the sudden stillness. Mark was in the living room, the TV muted, watching her face for answers. "They say it's Tommy," she said finally. Her voice cracked in the middle. Mark didn't move at first, just stared at her. Then he stood, crossed the room, and took the car keys from the hook by the door. By the time Diane pulled into the station lot, the October wind had picked up, rattling the flagpole out front. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, engine running, headlights cutting across the side of the building. Inside, the man in the interview room had gone still, eyes fixed on a spot on the tabletop. Harris sat across from him, trying again. "Tommy, we need to understand where you've been." "Nothing." "Why now? Why come back today?" The man's gaze lifted briefly, and there was something unreadable there. "I told you. For Buster." When Diane stepped through the doorway and saw him, her breath caught. The jawline was sharper, the eyes older, but there was something, a shadow of the boy she'd known. She stopped halfway into the room, searching his face. "Tommy?" He looked up, and for a fraction of a second, she thought she saw recognition. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by that same guarded stillness. In the silence that followed, Harris glanced between them. Outside the closed door, a phone started ringing, insistent, unanswered. And sitting there, Diane realized she didn't know if the man in front of her was truly her son, or someone who had learned to wear his face. If this story touched you, even a little, let me know in the comments. We read them all. She stood in the doorway and didn't move. The interview room was the size of a storage closet. Cinderblock walls painted a tired beige, a bolted table, two metal chairs that squeaked if you breathed wrong. The air smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. A ceiling vent rattled softly. He sat with his hands laced on his knees, eyes fixed on the scuffed tile between his boots, shoulders drawn in as if he were bracing for weather that hadn't arrived yet. "Tommy," she said. No reaction. Not a flinch, not a breath caught. A minute stretched long enough for her to hear her own pulse. Harris, standing just out of his line of sight, shifted his weight and looked at the floor. Somewhere down the hall, a printer coughed. She said his name again, gently this time, like she'd said it at bedtime when he was 10. He lifted his head slowly, as if the muscles had forgotten the sequence. His eyes met hers for the first time. The voice that came out was steady but quiet, the edges sanded down by use. "You haven't changed." Her mouth opened and closed. It was the sentence itself, but it was also how he said it. Not like a compliment or a relief, but like an observation you make when you are testing a memory against a photograph. She took a step in. Up close, age had been unkind. He looked older than the late 20s man he should have been. Thin, skin sallow. A crescent scar peeked above the collar at the base of his throat, the kind that belongs to a cut that healed without stitches. Two pale bands ringed each wrist, as if something had lived there a long time and only recently left. "Tommy," she tried again, and this time her voice found warmth. "It's Mom." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. His gaze ran over her face like someone reading a map they used to know. When she moved to close the distance, he tensed. Not an obvious recoil, more a tightening, a split-second shift of breath. She saw it, stopped, then ignored it, and stepped forward anyway, because 17 years is a long time to practice restraint. Her arms went around him. It lasted less than a second. His hands shot up and pressed against her shoulders. Not a shove, exactly, but forceful, automatic. The kind of movement you make when hot grease pops and you flinch before you think. She rocked back, shocked more by the reflex than the contact. His face drained. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, the words stumbling over each other. I didn't mean, I'm sorry." He looked at Harris, then back to the table, and his fingers tapped once, twice, before he locked them again. "It's okay," she lied. Her arms hung useless at her sides. "It's okay, honey." Harris pulled the spare chair out with a low scrape and gestured. Diane sat, purse in her lap, knuckles white around a wad of tissues she hadn't realized she'd taken. The fluorescent light above them buzzed, flickered, steadied. Harris kept his voice gentle. "Tommy, we need to ask you some things, just the basics. Where you've been. If you're hurt. If you need a doctor." He paused. "If there's anyone else we need to help." Tommy's jaw moved like he was chewing a thought. When he spoke, his sentences came in small pieces, as if each had to be inspected before it passed. "I'm fine. No doctor." A pause. "Don't like doctors." Another pause, eyes flicking to the mirror as if he knew it was a mirror. "I was away." "Away where?" Harris asked. Tommy's gaze drifted to the ceiling vent. The muscles in his neck tightened, and the thin scar at his throat shifted when he swallowed. "Where Buster waits." Diane felt the ground lurch. "Buster?" Her voice cracked on the name. "Baby Buster! That was—" She stopped, couldn't finish the sentence. The dog had lived a good long time, but years have limits. You don't prepare to say a pet's name in a police station 17 years later, and have it be the first thing that makes sense. Tommy looked at her, and for a second emotion pushed past the practiced stillness, quick and almost feral. But he's not there now. he said softly, not as a question. The next breath scraped. He's gone, right? She nodded, and the nod fractured something inside her. He's gone. Silence filled the room like water. Tommy's hands flattened on his knees again. The tapping stopped. He stared at a point somewhere on the table edge, and whatever thread had been connecting him to the conversation went slack. Harris tried to bridge the space. Tommy, can you tell us about the place where you were? Anything. A name, a road, who you were with. Tommy's lips parted, then closed. A strange delay hung between his thoughts and his words, like a bad phone line. Green, he said finally. The walls were green. He blinked, recalibrated. Night, trains, every night. But not close, just... He lifted a hand, drew a lazy line through the air as if tracing a sound. Like thunder that knows where it's going. Diane leaned in. Were you alone? Another pause. He swallowed. Can't say. Harris softened his tone further, coaxing. We just want to help the people who helped you. Or stop the people who hurt you. That's our job. Tommy's eyes went flat. He shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. Doors stayed locked. Who locked them? Harris asked. Tommy's gaze slid toward the mirror again. The next words came clipped, like he was stepping on stones he wasn't sure would hold. The man with the hat. A beat. He kept the keys. His fingers twitched, and he pulled his hands into fists. Held, released. Don't want to. The last two words fell out bare. Diane reached across the table and stopped just short of touching him. The distance was the size of a palm, and it felt miles wide. Tommy, look at me. He did. She saw the boy for an instant, like catching a reflection in a passing window. The quick spark of recognition, the urge to be reassured. And then it was gone, under layers she couldn't see through. Harris exchanged a glance with Langford through the glass. The officer on the other side lifted her brows, the unspoken question hanging. Do we keep going like this? Tommy, Harris said. One more try. Why today? Why come to us now? He blinked slowly. Because you took him. The ghost of a smile touched his mouth, not amused, not kind. My dog. Diane pinched the bridge of her nose, as if pressure might keep everything inside from spilling out. The clock above the door clicked over 1 minute. Harris exhaled through his nose, then leaned back. Okay, he said, and it wasn't surrender so much as a marker planted in shifting ground. Okay. When they stepped out into the hallway, the door snicked shut behind them with the soft kiss of a well-oiled hinge. The hum of the station rose around them, radios murmuring, keys clattering, the distant clang of a cell door closing. Harris rubbed his jaw. We're not going to get more tonight. Not like this. Langford nodded, eyes still on the one-way glass. He's not just traumatized. He's trained. The pauses, the non-answers. He knows how not to say things. Or how not to think them, Harris said quietly. Down the corridor, the chief was already on the phone. He covered the receiver with his hand when he saw Harris and jerked his chin toward the interview room. How's your miracle? Harris didn't answer the sarcasm. He won't talk. The chief went back to the call. Yes, he said into the line. We'll need you. Tonight, if you can swing it. The Carver kid. Yes, that one. He listened, then nodded to no one. We'll set up a room. Diane stood alone outside the glass, watching her son sit very still, hands folded, eyes on the table like it might tell him the rules if he stared long enough. Behind her, footsteps approached in crisp, unhurried beats. Two men turned the corner in dark suits with badge wallets already out, the cooler air of the night still clinging to their sleeves. Agents Miller and Vega, the taller one said, voice low, professional. "We'll take it from here." They moved him to a quieter room down the hall. No mirror, no camera obvious, just a round table and a window that looked over the parking lot where the flag hung limp in the cool October air. A nurse drew blood with practiced hands. He watched the needle without blinking, jaw set, the tendons in his neck standing out like cables. Swabs brushed the inside of his cheeks. An agent sealed them with blue tape and signatures, the ritual of custody performed like a prayer. By morning, the lab had called twice. First, the prints. Partials lifted from the man matched older, latent impressions from Tommy's childhood things. A model airplane, a baseball trophy, collected in 1992 when the case was still fresh, and the FBI had told Mark and Diane, "Leave everything as is." Not enough to stand alone, maybe, but enough to lean on. Then the call everyone had braced for. The DNA kinship test came back greater than 99.99% probability. Thomas Carver was Thomas Carver. Meeting certainty did not bring relief. It brought questions into focus. Agents Miller and Vega set up in the conference room with a rental printer and a stack of authorization forms. They ran his name through every database that would listen. Nothing. No birth certificate used to open accounts. No school enrollment after 1992. No driver's license applications. Not even a rejected one. No Social Security earnings after the year he disappeared. No ER admissions. No prescriptions filled. No insurance claims. That blank space wasn't just rare. It was surgical. It read like life had been siphoned out of the public record and left to pool somewhere no one could see. They brought in Dr. Leah Marston, a forensic psychologist who had spent years in rooms just like this, asking people to unpack the things they'd learned never to say. She introduced herself with a small smile and no clipboard, then sat at an angle to him so he didn't have to meet her eyes to be heard. He was wary at first, answering with hand-sized scraps of sentences, the edges squared off. His voice had a rhythm to it, staccato, then a drag, as if certain words had to be hauled up from deeper water. She didn't push names. She asked for colors, textures, sounds. "Tell me about a wall," she said. "Green," he said, almost before she finished. "Not bright. Dull. Like school paint. Scuffed. You can see where a chair hit it. 2 lines." His hand sketched a bracket in the air. "What did it feel like where you slept?" "Springs," he said, frowning like he could taste the word. "One poked. Back right corner. If you move wrong, it bites." "At night?" He blinked. "Trains," he said, and his eyes tracked an invisible line beyond the glass. "You know when a storm is far and the thunder is already tired? Like that? And the metal smell? The thick tar stuff on the wood outside?" He groped for it. "Creosote?" she offered. He nodded once. "And a bell. Not always. Some nights. 2, 4. Then it stops." His hand tapped a slow pattern against his knee. 4 beats. Pause. 2 beats. As if a crossing arm lived inside his muscles. Who else was there? The pause stretched. When the words came, they were careful, placed like you set down glass. Doors stayed shut. Who had the keys? A shadow crossed his face. "The hat," he said. The hat watched. He lifted his hand to the brim of an invisible cap, fingers finding the gesture without permission. He made it quiet. "How?" Tommy's throat worked. "You learn," he said finally. "If you make it quiet, it stays small." Marston didn't write anything down. She watched his shoulders, how they rose when certain questions approached and dropped when she passed them by. In the next room, separated by drywall thin enough to take a nail, Diane listened with her palms pressed together, her wedding ring biting crescent moons into her skin. She had been given the chair directly under the air vent. It breathed cold onto the back of her neck, and the sound of it braided with his description of trains until she couldn't unhear one from the other. Miller and Vega took his phrases and laid them over maps. They called a rail detective who owed Vega a favor and asked for yard diagrams and night schedules from the mid-90s. They traced lines south and east from Riverton, looking for places where a main line and a secondary crossed within earshot of houses still old enough to be painted with institutional green. The creosote detail narrowed it further. Old ties, old platforms, old money. The bell pattern mattered too. Some crossings cycled on fixed intervals based on approach sensors. Others stayed manual longer, erratic in the way he described. A pin settled near the state line, a wheat town with a population small enough to count by surnames. Northern Missouri. 2 tracks cut through its belly. The siding yard hadn't been modernized back then. Agents pulled police blotters from 1993 to 1996, the years when time would have been hardest on a child, and the paper files arrived in a banker's box that smelled like the inside of a church basement. In the stack, under a report about a fight behind a bar, a series of calls flickered. White panel van seen near an elementary school bus stop, white van idling on Elm and Fifth, white van slowing near a ball field, driver described as male, white, 30s, hat. No plates captured, no arrests. Officers wrote, patrolled area, negative contact, in neat cursive, and moved on with their lives. The descriptions were a river running next to the story they already had, never touching it until now. When Diane heard another state and white van in the same breath, her mind started making shapes she hadn't given herself permission to name. She went back over Tommy's words, the way he never said I when the rooms got small. The pronouns got slippery. We learned. We listened. We weren't to ask. She hadn't noticed at first because hearing your child speak at all after 17 years is like standing up after a long illness. You're grateful, dizzy, less precise than you should be. She found Marston in the hallway between sessions and asked, voice hardly above air, "Why does he talk like there were more?" Marston didn't answer for a moment. "Because he's remembering togetherness," she said, "or because he can't bear to remember alone." They brought him coffee that went cold untouched. He didn't ask for food, but when a turkey sandwich appeared, he ate it methodically, chewing each bite the same number of times, stopping mid-swallow when footsteps passed, then finishing as if a timer had been restarted. At one point, a train horn sounded in the distance, the real line that skirted the highway beyond town, and he flinched barely, eyes flicking toward the window as if to confirm which life he was in. "Tommy," Miller tried again, late afternoon lengthening the shadows across the table. "You said there were bells some nights. Could you hear shouting? Music? A TV?" A small crease appeared between his brows. "Music," he said. "But not from the room. Outside. A woman singing about rain? Number..." He shook his head. "Blue. The word blue. And glass breaking sometimes. Fridays." Miller wrote "bar jukebox" to himself and slid the note to Vega. Vega circled it, already thinking of the town's only 2 taverns and whether either had kept an old machine in the corner. By evening, a thin wire connected Riverton to that Missouri grid. Agents called the local department there and asked about old properties along the tracks with green-painted interiors, a church daycare that closed, a boarding house in disrepair, a decommissioned depot, a maintenance shed, anything that fit the texture of his recall. The sergeant on the other end said he'd have to dig. "We had a couple places," he said, voice getting softer when they told him why. "I remember a white van thing. People called it in for a while. We never—" He didn't finish the sentence. Diane stayed until her eyes burned. She watched through the glass as Marston shifted tactics, offering him safe details to agree or disagree with. He did neither reflexively. He checked himself, then chose. At one point, when she almost put her hand on the door, Tommy's voice carried through. "Keep the doors shut." He wasn't talking to anyone in particular. It still stopped her. The file that Vega slid across the table to Miller just before midnight had a photocopied map clipped to the front. A hand-drawn star by a curve in the rail where the yard framed a line of weathered houses. Behind it, a stack of incident reports from 1994 with the same plateless van described again and again. The driver sometimes in a ball cap, sometimes a brimmed hat. Each report ended with a line that read like ritual. Unable to locate. On top of the stack, Marston's summary of the day's session. Language marked by guardedness. Dissociation present. Sensory anchors reliable. References suggest at least one other minor present at times. Diane read the last sentence twice and felt the floor tilt. She pictured a room the size of her laundry closet, painted an institutional green, a mattress where a spring bit the back right if you moved wrong, and two sets of breaths adjusting to the same night train. She pressed a palm to the glass, not because she thought he could feel it, but because her body needed something solid. In the parking lot, the October wind picked up, and the flag finally stirred. Inside, the printer spat out one more sheet, an address in a town that none of them had visited, but all of them suddenly knew too well by its sounds. Vega tapped the page with his index finger. "We go at first light," he said. From the other room, through two doors and a length of sterile hallway, Tommy's voice arrived thin but clear, almost conversational, as if he were remembering a rule that had kept him alive. "If they ask," he said, "you say you were alone." He paused, then corrected himself under his breath, softer, like a habit breaking. "We were alone." The drive south started before sunrise. The two FBI SUVs rolled out of Riverton in silence, headlights carving the dark in twin beams. Diane sat in the back of the lead vehicle, her hands knotted in her lap. She had refused to stay behind. Miller didn't argue, but he'd set the rule. She wouldn't go inside. Not until they knew what they were walking into. Northern Missouri looked different than she remembered from the map. Fields stretched flat and damp. Fences sagged under their own weight, and the rail line appeared and vanished alongside the highway like a shadow pacing them. Every so often, a long freight train would thunder past, and even inside the car she could feel it in her ribs. The town itself barely made a mark on the landscape. 2 blocks of brick storefronts, a co-op, a post office with its flag hanging limp. The rails cut straight through the middle. On one side, houses with peeling paint, a church with a steeple like a broken pencil. On the other, warehouses, and, beyond them, a line of poplar trees hiding the view. The local police chief was waiting in the parking lot of his station, coffee in one hand, a thin folder in the other. He was graying at the temples, eyes tired in a way that said this place hadn't given him much good news lately. "I remember the van reports," he told Vega, shaking his head. "We chased them. Never caught up. Folks stopped calling after a while. Figured it was just some drifter passing through." He hesitated, flipping the folder open. "There's something else." Inside were yellowed clippings from the county paper, dated August 1994. Headline: Local girl missing, 10 years old. Last seen walking home from a friend's. Search parties. Tearful parents on the courthouse steps. And then, nothing. No follow-up articles. No resolution. She just vanished, the chief said quietly. "We never found her." Miller exchanged a glance with Vega. The timeline sat too close to Tommy's. They drove out past the poplars, following a dirt road that ran parallel to the tracks. The air smelled of damp earth and old creosote from the ties. After a mile, the trees thinned, revealing a house slouched against the edge of a weed-choked yard. The windows were boarded over. The paint, once white, had been stripped by weather into warped gray slats. The front steps sagged under the weight of their own rot. Inside, the air was heavy, close. Dust motes hung in the beams of their flashlights. The living room was empty except for a toppled chair and a water-stained couch, with the stuffing clawed out. Footprints in the dust, some fresh, some not, crossed in random arcs. The basement door stuck halfway before Vega forced it open. The smell hit first. Mildew, rust, something faintly sweet gone sour. The stairs creaked under their boots, and the flashlights cut through a low-ceilinged space lined with crumbling stone. In the far corner stood a child's bed frame, metal bars eaten with rust, a thin mattress sagging in the middle. Beside it, a plastic bin spilled over with toys, a headless action figure, a puzzle missing most of its pieces, a stuffed bear so damp it had gone gray. Against the wall, bolted into the stone, was a length of chain with a worn loop at one end. Miller crouched, ran a gloved finger over the metal. The wear wasn't from this decade, but it was unmistakable. They documented everything: wide shots, close-ups, evidence bags sealed. The chain went in first, then the toys, then the mattress tag, brittle but still legible. Back in the SUV, they showed Tommy a photo of the house on a tablet. His reaction was instant and sharp, his breath hitched, eyes locking on the image as if it had a pulse. Then his face changed, panic climbing fast. "No," he said, voice too loud for the small space. "No, that's not it." He pushed the tablet away hard enough to send it skidding across the seat. Miller tried to steady him. "It's okay. We just—" "Not the place," Tommy snapped. His chest was heaving, but his eyes kept darting toward the photo, even as he turned his head away. His hands were shaking in a way they hadn't before, not even during the interviews. Dr. Marston, riding in the second SUV, slid in beside him. "You're safe," she said, voice level. "It's just a picture." He shut his eyes tight. "It's wrong. It's wrong." He rocked once, twice, the rhythm short and hard. "Don't put me there." Marston exchanged a quick look with Miller. Not fear, but recognition. Later, in the quiet, she told them, "This could be a false memory block. Sometimes, if someone's been conditioned to recall a place as something else, the real one triggers panic. That kind of reaction, it's not voluntary." They brought the physical evidence back to the local station. While agents catalogued the chain and toys, Diane stood at the edge of the table, arms folded tight, not speaking. She didn't look at the bed frame photos. But when Vega laid out the last print, a wide shot of the basement wall behind the mattress, she leaned in. At first it looked like scratches. Then she saw the letters, uneven and shallow, carved into the stone. 6 letters. B-U-S-T-E-R. The room went still. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. "That could be anyone's doing," the chief said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Diane's throat tightened. "No," she said, almost a whisper. "That's him. That's his dog." Vega glanced at Miller. "But according to him," he said slowly, "he was never here." Miller didn't answer. His eyes were still on the photo. The carving was rough, but the letters had a certain shape. A childish hand, pushing too hard into the stone, repeating strokes until they cut deeper. That night, Tommy slept in a monitored room at the Riverton station. Or at least, he lay still on the bed. Through the feed, they saw him stare at the ceiling for hours. Once, near 3 a.m., he sat up, rubbed his wrists, and whispered something they couldn't catch. When Marston asked him about it in the morning, he only said, "I wasn't talking to you." In a locked drawer down the hall, the basement photos waited. The word carved into the stone was there whether he claimed the place or not. And in the gap between his denial and that evidence, the outline of another story was starting to take shape. One that no one in that building was ready to tell out loud. They'd moved the sessions to a smaller room at the end of the hall where the vents didn't rattle and the glass didn't watch. No mirror. No hum of the bullpen. Just a cheap floor lamp. 2 chairs angled so the knees didn't point at each other, and a lens in the corner with a steady red eye. Dr. Marston always arrived first and set a paper cup of water on the windowsill to warm out of the air conditioning. Tommy came in second, shoulders compressed, eyes tracking the corners before he sat. He didn't speak for several minutes, just picked at a split in his thumbnail until a dot of red surfaced. When he finally looked up, it wasn't at her. It was at the camera. "Turn it off," he said. Marston followed his gaze. "The recording protects you," she said, keeping her voice even. "It protects all of us." "Turn it off," he repeated, quieter, like a plea he didn't want to hear himself make. Miller was behind the door with a legal pad. Vega leaned against the far wall, arms crossed. There was a policy. There are always policies. Marston weighed them against the way his right foot had started to tap. Small, fast, barely there movements that meant the room was shrinking. She stood, reached up, and covered the lens with a square of black gaffer tape they kept for this reason. The red eye disappeared. The silence that followed had a shape. Tommy exhaled once, hard, like the air had been held under his ribs. "At night," he said, and the words came faster than she'd heard them from him. "Sometimes the door opened. It wasn't loud. You'd hear the lock turn and the key scrape because he kept too many on the ring. He'd stand there a second and listen." He swallowed, eyes on some fixed point over her shoulder. "If you moved, he told you not to. If you didn't move, he told you to. He'd take one. A kid. He never took both. The one he took didn't come back." Marston didn't touch her pen. "How many times?" I can't count the times," he said, the cadence slipping, words crowding each other. He had a way he did things, and the way never changed. And if you could keep the way, you stayed. If you break the way— He stopped himself with a short shake of the head, breath snagging. "Number I can't. If I say it, they'll find me again." "Who will?" she asked softly. He pressed his palm to his throat where the pale scar lived. "He had a name," he said, "but not the one he wore outside. Inside, he was a sound, a knock. You hear it, and you go quiet. If I say it, he knows." "You're safe here," Marston said, and heard how thin it sounded even as she said it. Tommy's eyes cut to the door as if measuring the distance. "Doors aren't safe," he said. "Keys are." The speed drained out of him as quickly as it had come. The next words arrived stripped to bone. "I had another name," he said. Marston let the sentence sit. "What was it?" He worked his jaw like he was testing if it would hold. "Evan," he said at last. "Sometimes Jules. Depends who asked. Never the same place twice. People paid cash. I'd dig holes, move lumber, clean lots. He kept me where you don't sign things." His gaze went to the window. "No mail. No bills. If the lights were on, they were on because a line ran to someone who wouldn't ask." "Where?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not a town. Not on a map you buy. Across the county line there's land nobody claims because the deed holder died and the kids moved away and the fence fell, and the county never cared. His mouth flattened. We were there, until we weren't. Miller slid a thin folder onto the table, an old county atlas copied to grayscale. Someone decades ago had drawn with a red wax pencil, irrigation ditches, culverts, a surveyor's mark, and the lines had ghosted through the copy. Marston turned it so the north arrow pointed toward Tommy. We're going to talk about shapes, she said. Nothing else. Tell me if any of these shapes feel familiar. He barely glanced down at first, almost defiant. Then the old symbols began to cohere. The rail line appeared as twin black cords. A dirt road broke off at a slant, and near the margin, where the contour lines tightened into a nest, a small red dot sat next to a notch in the terrain. His hand moved before his face did. 2 fingers came down and held on the dot like he was stopping it from rolling away. His voice changed, not louder, not softer, but focused, like a sight had just aligned. There, he whispered. He marked there. That's where they hid things. What things? Marston asked, careful, almost breathless, without meaning to be. He didn't answer immediately. His fingers stayed on the map. The skin at his temples pulsed. Stuff that wasn't supposed to be seen, he said finally. Stuff that made noise if you left it too long. You get told to carry and not to look. If you look, you say it was tools. His eyes flicked up, apology tangling with defiance. I didn't look. Not always. Marston felt the room tighten around the words. Is it far? From the tracks? No, he said. You hear the horn, and you count to 40 if he's slow, 30 if he's moving. The ground changes right before it. Rocks turn sharp, and the trees— His hand paused mid-air, drawing the silhouette of a trunk. Cottonwoods and something that sheds red bark in strips. Sumac, she said. He nodded. There's a cut in the land people call the canyon because they've never seen a real one. A wash where the water runs in spring. There's a hole behind a flat rock big enough to sit 3 people if you don't mind knees touching. His throat worked. He said, if you can talk, you can breathe. And if you can breathe, you can carry. Miller's pen moved for the first time. Vega leaned in toward the map, then toward the door. He didn't have to speak for the plan to start forming. The room felt it pivot around the red dot. Marston stayed with Tommy. You did nothing wrong, she said. You stayed alive in a system meant to erase you. If I say it out loud, he said, eyes gone far again, he'll hear. It's how that works. He hears, and he starts again. He can't start again, Marston said. He looked at her then like he was measuring whether she believed what she was saying. You don't know the kind of starting he did. They sat with the map between them, the copy paper wobbling slightly in the air from the vent. Outside, a semi downshifted on the highway, the sound rounded by distance into a low note. Tommy's shoulders twitched and settled. He reached for the cup on the sill, drank, set it down with care like putting something back where it belonged. Will you go there? He asked, not looking at her. Yes, Marston said, but not if you don't want us to. He flinched at the choice. The old training had been built on the removal of it. He rubbed at the pale grooves around his wrists as if the skin remembered pressure. He marked it, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Marks are for coming back. Then we make a different kind of mark, Marston said. Through the partially open door, they could hear voices gather, the tempo of agents organizing, radios checked, fuel topped, coordinates copied to phones that would keep reception where the land fell away. Diane's footsteps approached and stopped just shy of the threshold, the pause of someone who knew that a single sound could scatter a fragile thing. Tommy slid the map an inch toward Marston, a concession or a benediction. "Don't make noise," he said quietly. "If you make noise, it wakes the place up." Marston stood, gave him the smallest nod, not gratitude, not victory, just acknowledgement that something had shifted and couldn't be shifted back. When she peeled the tape from the camera lens, the red eye returned with a blink. Tommy watched it, and didn't flinch this time. His breathing had evened out, but his hands trembled on their own schedule. In the hall, Miller said they'd roll in 20. Vega wanted a second team to circle from the service road. The chief from Missouri was already on the line, saying he'd meet them at the old quarry turnoff. Diane said nothing, but when she caught Marston's eye, the look held both terror and a kind of hard, narrow hope. Before they left, Marston asked one more question she knew she might regret. "If we find what he hid," she said, "does it help?" Tommy's answer was almost too soft to hear. "Helps you," he said. "Helps the counting. Doesn't change nights." He glanced at the map once more, at the small red dot near the canyon, and then away, as if he'd looked long enough to point, but not long enough to be pulled back. They closed the folder, and the room exhaled. Outside, the day had turned the color of pewter. Somewhere to the south, a horn sounded, long and low, and the beat of footsteps tilted toward the door that led to the parking lot. The convoy left Riverton under a sky the color of ash, the kind that presses low and seems to muffle sound. Miller drove point, Vega behind him, and a county cruiser trailing in case they needed a quick perimeter. Diane rode in the middle seat of the lead SUV, her knees turned toward the window, watching the fields give way to the rockier ground Tommy had described. Tommy was in the back, wrists loose on his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. He hadn't agreed easily. At first he'd said nothing at all, just stared at the map like the red dot might burn through the page. But Diane's voice, quiet, almost apologetic, had tipped him forward. "I'll be there," she told him. "You won't be alone." The road narrowed to a single lane of cracked asphalt, then to gravel that rattled under the tires. The rails appeared again, tracking them at a distance, the steel dark against the pale morning. Vega's GPS chirped every mile, reminding them how far from signal they were creeping. By the time they reached the canyon turnoff, the sun had shifted high enough to glare off the stone. Cottonwoods lined the wash below, their leaves rattling in a restless wind. The track down was barely a trail, more a thread of packed dirt winding between boulders. They parked on the shoulder and went the rest on foot. The canyon walls rose in uneven slabs, some streaked with rust-red mineral, others bleached to chalk. The air smelled of dry earth and the faint tang of iron. Each step sent gravel skittering down the slope. Diane kept glancing over her shoulder, not at the team behind her, but at the canyon lip above, as if expecting someone to be watching. Tommy stayed between Miller and Vega, his pace measured, hands hovering near his sides like he didn't trust the ground not to change under him. At one bend, where the trail narrowed to the width of a doorframe, he stopped without warning. His breathing had quickened. "Here," he said. Not to any of them in particular. Miller crouched, scanned the rock face. The canyon wall here folded inward, forming a shallow recess mostly hidden from the trail. Behind a screen of sumac and wind-fallen branches, a gap yawned low to the ground. The opening was no higher than a man's waist, the rock worn smooth at the edges from weather or use. Vega ducked inside first, flashlight beams slicing through the dim. The air was cooler, carrying a smell of dust and something else. Faint, organic, the scent of paper or cloth left to age in the dark. The cave wasn't deep, just a narrow chamber maybe 10 feet in. But at the back, half buried under loose stones, was a box. Metal, the paint long gone, its corners dented and one hinge barely holding. Vega brushed away grit and found the latch still worked. The lid creaked as it opened. Inside lay a child's dress, yellow once but dulled to beige, the fabric stiff. Next to it, a small stuffed dog, no bigger than a hand, missing one button eye. A handful of Polaroids fanned under the dress, faded images of children in mismatched clothes, squinting into the sun. One was Tommy, maybe 10, hair longer, thinner than in the missing poster, standing in front of a chain-link fence. Miller passed the photo to Diane outside the cave. She stared at it, thumb brushing the edge. "I've never seen this," she murmured. "Not like this." Inside the box was more. A cracked plastic hairbrush, 2 marbles, a paperclip chain knotted into itself, and at the bottom, tucked under a sheet of newspaper dated 1995, a leather dog collar. The brass tag still clung to the ring, tarnished but legible. Buster. Vega froze, eyes flicking toward Tommy. "You remember this?" he asked carefully. Tommy's gaze locked on the collar, and something shifted in his expression. Not recognition in the way they expected, but a tightening, a shadowed calculation. "That's his," Tommy said. "Buster?" Diane's voice broke on the name. Tommy's breathing picked up. "Not the dog," he said. His voice was louder now, brittle. "Don't say it like that. Not the dog." Miller stepped closer, palms out. "Tommy, it's okay. Just tell us—" "Not the dog." Tommy's shout ricocheted off the stone. He backed into the canyon wall, shoulders hunched, hands gripping the air as if to push something unseen away. "You think it's a dog because they told you it's a dog. That's how you keep it nice in your head." Diane reached for him, but he flinched hard enough to stumble sideways. "Then who was Buster?" she asked, her words barely more than air. Tommy shook his head fast, eyes gone glassy. "You don't want that," he said. "You don't want it in your head." The agents closed the box, sealed it in an evidence bag. The trail back felt longer, the sun harsher. The canyon walls seemed to lean closer, carrying the echo of Tommy's voice with them. Diane walked behind him, her eyes on the evidence bag swinging from Vega's hand, the leather collar inside catching slivers of light. They climbed back to the vehicles without speaking. Only when the SUVs started toward town did Tommy lean forward from the back seat and say, to no one in particular, "You shouldn't have gone there. Some things don't like being found." Miller met Vega's eyes in the rear view. Neither of them said it, but both were already thinking the same thing. The collar wasn't just an object. It was a name. And the way Tommy had said it, the way it hollowed the air, meant they were still nowhere near the end. They put the evidence box in a locker with a tamper seal and logged it twice, once by the book, and once because Vega didn't trust the book. The item list read like an inventory from a yard sale. Child's dress, plush dog, 3 Polaroids, hairbrush, marbles, paperclip chain, newspaper scrap, leather collar with tag. Under notes, Miller wrote, "Collar inscribed Buster." The interviews started again that evening. A storm was pushing up from the south, and the air in the station turned metallic, as if the building had a nosebleed. Tommy sat across from Marston, eyes on the recorder as if considering whether to ask for the tape to be blacked out again. He didn't. He just folded his hands, palms damp, and began without prompting. "You want to know who he was," he said. "You keep making him soft. He wasn't soft." Marston kept still. "What did he call himself?" "He didn't have to," Tommy said, almost irritated. "Everyone else did it for him." "Buster?" she asked. Tommy swallowed. "That's what people said when they wanted to make him something you could talk about at work. Buster came by. Buster fixed the lock. Buster'll take care of it." Out loud, that's what they said. His gaze slid off her shoulder. Inside, he was... the hat, the keys, the sound of the lock finding home. Did he tell you his real name? Tommy shook his head. Sometimes he joked. Said names were for dogs, not men. You give a dog a name so it comes when you call. Did he take other kids? Marston asked, and the room seemed to lean to hear the answer. Tommy's jaw worked. He'd open the door at night, he said, voice sheened with sweat. Sometimes he came back with one. Sometimes he left with one. If the one he took stopped, being loud, he carried them. I saw him go toward the cut in the land. After, he made me carry a box. He said, if I could talk, I could breathe, and if I could breathe, I could carry. His fist closed on nothing. I didn't look. You learn not to look. Do you remember the girl in '94? Marston asked. The file waited on the table between them like a hand no one wanted to shake. He stared at the cardboard edge until his eyes filmed. I remember a dress, he said. Yellow once. It was not yellow anymore. Miller and Vega took those words to the records room. The county librarian, called in after hours, rolled a microfilm reader into the conference space and taught them how to thread it like it was 1987 again. The screen glowed blue, and the town's history flickered past in reverse. Fair winners, lost dogs, church suppers, the week the river jumped its banks. Reports of a white van returned and returned, thin as smoke. Then a short stack of police memos from '96 and '97. Complaints about a man who did odd jobs along the rails, wore a hat even in July, kept keys on a lanyard that slapped his thigh when he walked. No booking sheet, no mugshot. A nickname, in quotes, Buster. One complaint escalated to a warrant request, denied for lack of probable cause. The file stopped. A year later, a death notice in the paper. Complications after surgery. Survived by no one. The name under the obituary was Earl B. Klein, 51. A note in the margin of a memo said, a K.A. Buster. Someone had closed the tab on a life and stapled it shut. He died in 2003, Vega said, tapping the date. If this is him, he's not whispering now. Unless someone else learned the way, Miller said, voice flat. They brought the clippings back to the room. When Marston laid the printout of the obituary beside Tommy's water cup, he flinched as if the paper conducted heat. His eyes scanned the block of text without seeming to read it. That's him? Marston asked. Tommy didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He reached up and touched the pale ring around his wrist, like the memory lived in the skin. He had two ways of laughing, he said instead, with teeth when people were looking, with no sound when they weren't. Miller leaned forward. We can prove what he did at the canyon, he said. We'll take the box apart. We'll get fiber, trace, if there's DNA. Tommy's mouth lifted at one corner in something that wasn't a smile. You think the rocks don't remember what you did to them just because you wash your hands? They kept him talking until the recorder's red light felt like a third heartbeat in the room. The storm finally broke, rain ticking against the window, and something eased in Tommy's shoulders, as if the sound belonged to a safer time. When Marston stood to end the session, he spoke again, unprompted, looking not at her, but at the dark outside. You think he's dead, he said softly. People like you always do. You have dates. You have a piece of paper to show each other. He turned his head, the movement slow, deliberate, like a camera pan. You didn't hear him last night. Miller stilled. Hear who? Tommy's eyes were suddenly lucid in a way they hadn't been for days. At my window, he said. He was close enough I could smell the oil on the keys. He told me to keep the way. He told me I was using the wrong name. He let the silence sit like a weight. You didn't hear him whisper. The room's temperature seemed to drop. Vega glanced at the logbook, at the note about the window sensors. They'd been armed. No alarms tripped. He told himself he believed the sensor more than a memory built in rooms without clocks. They ended the recording there. The last thing the microphone caught was the sound of a chair leg scraping the tile and the whisper of rain growing heavy enough to drown out the room. At midnight, Diane couldn't settle. The house was too quiet in the way houses are after too many days have been spent holding breath. She made tea she didn't drink and stood at the sink under the small kitchen window, watching the porch light burn a pale circle on the steps. The front door swelled and stuck when the weather turned. The humidity made the wood complain. A soft sound came from the porch, a small, irregular rasp. It could have been branches. It could have been the neighbor's cat. It could have been everything ordinary and harmless that a night provides. She set the mug down and listened. The scratch came again. Not frantic. Testing. A patient sound. She told herself not to open the door. She opened the door. Cool air slid across her forearms. The porch boards creaked under her weight. For a moment, there was nothing but rain, and the smell of damp wood, and somewhere far off the ghost of a train horn, rounded by distance into a single low syllable. Then she saw it, sitting neatly against the left side of the threshold, outside the reach of the roof's drip, a small stuffed dog. One button eye, the other gone. Brown once, now the color of old tea. It looked like the twin of the one they had bagged that afternoon. Not the same. The ear stitching was different, but close enough that her body didn't know the difference. She didn't touch it. She didn't step closer. She stood there and understood two things at once: that someone had been close enough to leave it, and that she would never know how it got there in a way that brought her sleep. Behind her, in the living room, the phone buzzed with a text from Vega. We pulled a name linked to Buster from a 1996 tip line. Case closed when Klein died. We'll brief at 0800. She didn't move to read it. Rain gathered on the porch rail and slipped off in fat drops. The toy dog watched nothing with its one eye. From Tommy's room down the hall, a floorboard ticked as the house settled, the sound so familiar it could have been any night in any year. Diane tightened her hand on the door edge until the wood bit her palm. Somewhere in the dark, a key turned in an old lock in a memory that wouldn't stay put. Somewhere else, a man who had died in 2003 lay still under a lawn no one visited. Between those places, a woman stood on a porch and tried to decide whether to bring a small, impossible thing inside. She left the toy where it was. She turned the deadbolt, then turned it again, as if that second turn could close a door the first could not. The house returned to its normal sounds, the hum of the fridge, the distant tick of the hallway clock. And beyond the glass, the rain made the world look blurred and manageable. She turned off the porch light. In the dark, for a long moment, she could still see the shape of the dog exactly where it had been. Then the image dissolved, and in its place was only the question the day had been dragging behind it like a broken shoe: whether what they had found in the canyon was a body of facts or just a set of marks left by someone who had been very good at teaching others how to keep the way. She didn't sleep. Near dawn, a train moved through on the far line, horn low, bell counting itself down. In Tommy's room, he turned on his side and faced the window. His lips moved, soundless. Whether he was answering someone or refusing to, no one could say.